Joan by Carol M Mottershead, Chapter 25. I hadn't realised people had been listening to our argument. I was embarrassed to hear it, yet Punchinella wanted to repeat the argument as part of the show. What did he think he was doing? They're my puppet shows. My puppets. How dare he think he can just push his way into my shows? I love performing my shows. They've given me independence and freedom from Punchinella for a short while. But working with him at every show? I would rather never do another show ever again. It was just typical of Punchinella, trying to take over, trying to run the show. Whenever anything takes his fancy, I didn't like it. I know he was only trying to find a way of becoming the breadwinner again, to boost his self-esteem. But why with my puppets? He's never shown any interest in them before. I felt guilty for feeling the way I did, but they were mine. As it happened, Punchinella didn't find taking part in children's shows very fulfilling or stimulating. He quickly bored with the childish banter. My talents are wasted, Joan. I am an actor. I am commedia dell'arte, no less. I am above such frivolous jovialities, he moaned. So that was the end of that, thank goodness. Nicholas finally graduated as a doctor of medicine. Everyone was thrilled for him. It was quite an achievement for one of our troupe to successfully break away from our line of work, for with no formal education to speak of, entertaining was all most of us would ever do with our lives. It was rewarding, all right, in many ways, to bring fun and laughter into people's lives, but it wasn't always enough to pay the bills. It was important to me that we celebrated Nicholas's success. I was proud of him. With his brilliant new career and his drive, my Nicholas would go far. He had a whole new life ahead of him. All his friends gathered at the local assembly rooms, and there was quite a mixture, with friends from the world of writers and friends from the world of medicine, plus our troupe. As nothing but the troupe, Punchinella piped in. Arthur had brought a couple of friends along, Caroline Norton, who he thought I might find interesting, and her grandfather, who was the owner of a theatre in London. He thought Punchinella might like chatting to him. Caroline was her grandfather's favourite grandchild, and apparently a bit of a rebel, her grandfather told us. Arthur introduced us. Caroline is a social reformer, Arthur told us. She has fought quite a lot for the rights of women and their children, he said. I listened to what she had to say. She spoke eloquently on the subject. Her arguments were quite persuasive. She'd had a lot to put up with when she was married. Her husband had taken everything from her, beaten her repeatedly, and when she tried to leave, he refused to let her see her children. I had to admire her for what she had achieved, but her reputation had reached my ears long ago. I'm not one for gossip, as I've said before. It's my line of work, that's all. But it was said that she had become closely involved with Lord Melbourne, the Queen's closest friend and adviser. He had been forced to give up his office because of her. They both lost favour with Her Majesty as a result, which was their undoing. Caroline used her influence to fight for the rights of women. Changes in the law had been made because of her efforts. There was the Custody of Children Act, the Marriage and Divorce Act, and the Married Woman's Property Act. What an amazing legacy. Women can even sue their husbands, she told me. But what good would that be to me, suing Punchinella? He has nothing, I joked with her. She just laughed. She was a very strong woman, inspirational in fact. Despite all she'd been through, she knew her own mind. I listened carefully to everything she said, but in all fairness, I couldn't totally agree with her, for she advocated divorce, and that was something I could never consider. I've said it before many times. I could never divorce Pulcinella. I know, I've called him Pulcinella again. But Pulcinella was the man I fell in love with. He changed. He became opinionated, cynical, verbally abusive, and cold-hearted. Pulcinella I fell in love with loved his family and would do anything for us. Anything. But Punchinella, well, he was not the same man. He was not the man I married. Gradually members of our family started moving away to find work. Commedia dell'arte plays were no longer in vogue. The few shows we did get asked to do just didn't earn enough to live on. Sadly, we had to sell our home. The whole troupe had paid into the purchase of the property, and now they needed their share of the investment back to pay for their new homes. Pulcinella suggested that the three of us moved somewhere best suited for Nicholas and his new line of work. Unusually supportive, I thought. All became clear all too soon. I knew that wherever there are children I could always find work. But with no players, no work, no direction, Punchinella needed to find something that would make him feel alive again. He informed us that he intended to sign up for the military once we had relocated. You and Nicholas don't need me anymore. You have each other. It's always been you and Nicholas anyway. Neither of you need me anymore. Not when I'm like this, contemptible as I am. I used to mean something to you, Joan, once. Now, he paused, looking directly into my eyes. You just tolerate me, don't you? I know you do. You don't have to say anything. I'm tired of feeling worthless. I'm tired of feeling as I do. I need to be challenged. I've decided to go to war. Do something noble for a change. Fight to the death, maybe, if I must. He smiled weakly, trying to make light of it. His statement came out of the blue. At first I was in shock. We'd always had each other. Even when we were apart, we knew it was only for a short time. It was the nature of the work. I was anxious, but at the same time, I started to feel a sense of relief. Even a little excited at the prospect of being free from Punchinella. The life we'd been living recently was no life at all. It was existing. I felt a little guilty at the thought, but at the same time, at the back of my mind, I was remembering the time Punchinella opened up to me and said he didn't want to live forever. It hurt me to hear him speak so. Wasn't I enough for him anymore? Did I mean so little to him that he would rather die than live with me? The arguments in my head went round and round, first happy, then sad. What was it I really wanted? Unfortunately for Punchinella, Every time he was sent to a battlefield, he returned. They'd send him back out, and he'd return again. No matter where he was sent, he always came back. I can't even die successfully, Joan. I'm a failure. Why won't he let me die? He said, pointing towards the sky. I tried to persuade him to get some help. I was so sure that if he would just talk to someone, he would get well again. Maybe I would have my Pulcinella back. Puncinella's mood swings were worsening every time he returned from yet another battle. The hallucinations, his nightmares about the devil dragging him down to hell. He wasn't sleeping well. I would dose him up with valerian some nights, just to give us all a rest. At least we could all get a good night's sleep instead of being kept awake with his whimpering, or worse still, screams. Nicholas worked long hours and liked occasionally to bring home his friends after work. Unfortunately, when Punchinella was home, his friends would get chased away with a flea in their ear, or worse. Puncinella's reputation was becoming such that even children in the street had started calling him Mr. Punch, and it wasn't long before others were calling him by the same. Nicholas stopped bringing friends home. Whenever I went out, I'd worry, for I never knew which version of my husband to expect upon my return. Some days he would be happy, charming, kind, and even have a meal cooked and on the table for my return. Then others would find him morose and ill-mannered. I started keeping a low profile when I first arrived home, giving myself time to gauge what mood he was in. Every day became the same. I would hope for the best whilst preparing for the worst. If only he would just get help, trust someone, talk to someone, but he wouldn't make friends with anyone. I felt I'd failed him. I'm his wife and I didn't know what to do. My puppets brought me no pleasure anymore. Being on edge all the time made them hard work. I cut back on the shows, taking only the occasional booking. You have to eat after all. But only the wealthy families. I could cope with the odd one or two, and they were usually well paid. Puncinella's moods were starting to affect my health too. One day I was walking home with some shopping when I overheard one of those suffragettes speaking in the market place about women having rights. Rights to be treated as equals in the workplace. Rights to be treated as equals in the home. Votes for women. I'd heard about these women, but living in a village in the northeast of England all those years, I'd never actually met any of them. They were similar to Caroline, spoke very convincingly about their cause. The right for women to vote. But unlike Caroline, they were quite aggressive with their protests, marches and violence. I couldn't agree with that. Violence isn't good no matter where it comes from or who from. After being discharged from yet another military force, Punchinella became brooding and morose. He was becoming very literal. He'd pick on a single word and make a big song and dance about it. It would start as a bit of fun, a bit of banter, but would turn nasty and hurtful till I had two options: either let him win the argument to keep the peace, or keep it up and get a slap for cheeking him. If he won, he'd start acting all playful and silly. I'd think the argument was over, but if I dared to laugh at him or say anything that made him feel belittled in any way, he'd turn evil again. Don't get me wrong, these were only on his bad days. We had many, many good times too. That was what made it so hard. Life would be going along swimmingly for months at a time. I would start to feel happy and safe at last. Then, wham! It would all kick off again. I was living on an emotional roller coaster, constantly on a knife edge, in fear of the next time. My nerves were in a fight or flight state all the time. Given my previous experiences of talking about my husband with Scaramouche and Arthur, I wasn't sure if I could dare to speak about him to anyone. Did I have the right to stick up for myself, like those suffragettes said? Or would that just be looking for trouble and cause more fights? No. I didn't like myself. I couldn't live in constant fear. I shouldn't have to live in constant fear. Not from my husband. Wasn't he supposed to protect me? To love me? I was feeling more desperate and alone every day. Then one day I met a lady called Emily whilst out shopping. I listened to her speak and felt empowered by what she had to say. Unfortunately, the words I heard, the empowerment I felt, left me once I returned home. It was like the life force had been sucked right out of me. My will to fight, my will to live. Life was too hard. Every day I reminded myself of what Emily said. I deserve respect. I'm not just a doormat to be spoken to like a street urchin. I have the right to defend myself. The chant gave me strength. I felt my fight coming back. Punchinella could call me a shrew for talking back to him. He could say horrid, hurtful words to belittle me, make me feel worthless, make me dislike myself. But if I am a shrew, he's the one who turned me into one, I began telling myself. I was born a noble, a lady, Dame Joan. I was taught to respect others, treat others as you yourself would like to be treated, to forgive others their transgressions. I'd forgiven him for kissing Polly that time. I was starting to rebuild myself. I'd never been what you call a shrinking violet. I'd always been able to give as good as I got from Punchinella. I'd even been known to give him to the most base of basic urges and hit him back. Violence only breeds violence, I reminded myself. To deliberately hurt another living soul is just not acceptable, I told myself over and over. When the violence poured over into my puppet shows, it was then that I realised I finally needed to get help. For my own sanity, if nothing else. I decided to go to one of the rallies where I heard another lady called Emily Davison this time. She announced that women could now get a divorce on the grounds of severe bullying or violence. The law has changed, she told the crowd of women standing before her, looking in my direction as she did so. It was like she was looking right into my soul and speaking directly to me. Emily went on to say that women had to report the violence to the police every time it happened, so that there was a record of its occurrence. As a Roman Catholic and of noble birth, I wouldn't agree to a divorce. I had married for life till death us do part. For some reason I had caught Emily's eye. It was as if she was drawn to me, and we started talking. She spoke to me as if she knew my plight intimately. It was uncanny how much of what she was saying I could relate to. "You don't have to stay with him, you know," said Emily. I said nothing, but quietly shook my head. "Catholic?" she asked. I nodded. "I see." Emily looked directly into my eyes, a look of empathy towards her new mute friend. I couldn't find the words to say how I was feeling, but in her eyes I must have looked like a lost child, helpless, afraid, and pitiful. I wanted desperately to cry out, "I can't go on! I can't live like this! Someone, please help me! See me! See my pain!" But instead all I could do was smile and rush away. Emily handed me a leaflet before I left. "Something to read," she said. I took it, pushed it into my pocket, and walked as quickly as I could, silently crying. The rain that now started hid my tears from the world. Later that night I was taking out the rubbish and took the leaflet from my coat pocket. I intended throwing it away, but something wouldn't let me. Curiosity? Defiance? I didn't know, but I put it into my apron pocket instead and took the rest of the rubbish outside. The leaflet told about the changes in the law that allowed not only for a woman to divorce her husband, but instead of a divorce she could ask for a legal separation, provided she could prove violence or abuse had taken place on a regular basis. A divorce I couldn't contemplate for a variety of reasons. Firstly, I was Catholic, an Italian Catholic at that. I would be excommunicated. Even though I already had my issues with believing in God, I still believed in the sanctity of marriage, my vows. Secondly, I would be an outcast from society. And last but not least, I was a lady, and a lady of noble birth has a duty to be above reproach. However, a legal separation, well, that could be something I could consider. After all, Punchinello was away a lot of the time, so I had already proven to myself that I could cope without him. Yes, it was definitely something worth thinking about. I had hoped that a separation could be avoided, but despite long periods of calm and peaceful living, there were still the bad times that would raise their ugly heads. Police became regular visitors to ours for a while. Then one day, Nicholas, who was now working long hours as a doctor, as well as his private lessons in alternative medicines, arrived home early. Punchinello usually behaved himself when Nicholas was home, but this time the argument was already in full swing when Nicholas walked in. It had started after one of Punchinello's pedantic word fights, and it had got out of hand. I refused to back down on whatever the subject was. It wasn't even anything important, but I was standing my ground. A fight ensued. We could be as bad as each other sometimes. Punchinello hadn't heard him come in and was about to hit me when Nicholas grabbed his father by the wrist to stop him. I picked up the telephone receiver to call the police, but Punchinello knocked Nicholas off balance and pushed him away, reaching for the phone. He yanked the cord from the wall to stop the call, just as the call was being answered. "You'll never call the police on me again," he yelled. "Mother, get out!" shouted Nicholas, grabbing hold of his father and shoving him down into the armchair, intending to verbally have a go at his father. But as Nicholas looked over his shoulder to see me leave, Punchinello took that opportunity to push Nicholas off balance again and felled him to the floor, putting his hands round his throat in his anger. "You're not man enough to take me on, son," Punchinello taunted Nicholas. "You've been wanting to take me on for a long time. Ha! Well, come on then. Get out of this if you can." "No!" I yelled, and grabbed at Punchinello's hair with both hands and pulled him off Nicholas with such force that he had to let go. "Get out! Get out!" I yelled at Nicholas. "Get out and don't get involved!" I screamed at him. Nicholas refused to leave and tried to push me out of the door for my own safety. But I tried pushing Nicholas towards the door instead, wanting to keep him safe, when suddenly I was spun around by Punchinella. Seeing him take aim to hit Nicholas, I stepped in the way, expecting the fist to stop short, with me in the way. But instead I received the full force of his fist, one almighty punch to my temple. I was knocked off balance. My head spun. I fell to the floor. My vision blurred as I fell. Then all went black.